lists on the passenger train that went out to Hayden. And yesterday we had Eleanor Bliss aboard, and we had some other historical characters, as the passenger train just does this once a year with Union Pacific and the safety train. I'd like to welcome you all today to the first of our summer brown bag lecture series. The series runs from today through September 7th. This is the first of our talks. They're every Friday at noon. Next week is Lou Wyman, and he runs the Wyman Museum out in Craig, and he's going to talk about the old and unusual objects that he's collected out there at the Wyman Museum. I'd like to remind everybody as well that we run tours 3 days a week prior to the brown bags. On Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays we run tours, again the same time period from now until September 7th. We have our Olympic Heritage walking tours on Tuesdays, the Mineral Springs walking tours on Wednesday, and the Downtown Historical walking tour on Thursdays. Those are at 9:30. All of the tours meet here at the museum except for the Mineral Springs tour meets over at the Bud Warner Memorial Library. So they're all the programs that we do here, aside from fundraisers, are free, so we do encourage your donations and memberships to help continue these programs. We're doing a partnership today with Emerald City Opera to welcome Charles Ralph from Fort Collins. We're very excited to have you today. I want to thank you personally for coming. I will be putting these listing of our programs and fundraisers here on the table with the beverages, as well as the July brown bag lecture list is out here as well. So I'd like to thank you all for coming, and thank you, Charles.
Miss,
Yes.
we went through the 3 walking tours this week, and they were excellent.
Good. Well, thank you
The
for the
moderator
feedback.
did a good job. They were excellent.
Great. Well, thank you for saying so. We really appreciate it. Thanks, Charles.
Well, delighted to be here, and I hope that I can entertain you and enlighten you about what happened in opera in Colorado in its earlier days. Before I do that, I want to point out that I have a couple of websites related to what has happened and what is happening in the state of Colorado. And this one is the current events website called Opera Pronto, and it chronicles all of the events in opera that are opera-related events in Colorado. Has biographical information on all the major singers and people who produce operas in the state of Colorado. And it is intended to be current and informative and complete. And you might be surprised to know how much opera occurs in the state of Colorado. And the key to that is that we have 4 universities who have opera programs, or have opera programs. And we have 13 opera companies in the state of Colorado at the moment that put on at least 1 or more opera per year. Rita, my wife, who's up here, and I go to about 25 or more operas per year in the state of Colorado, and a few outside the state of Colorado as well. The period I'm going to talk about in Colorado encompasses what was called the golden age of opera, but that golden age was limited to a rather elite clientele of people. If you happen to live near an opera house, have access to it and means to go there, it was a golden age, but for most of America it was not necessarily a golden age. What we're in now is a very golden age of opera. We have more opera companies in America than we've ever had, casting to theaters around the world, and so opera is available. What's going on in Colorado in opera? Give me your email address. I will be glad to mail you every week a copy of the Opera Pronto newsletter. I think you'll find it very informative and very, very useful. There is also a couple of books that are relevant here by my friend Alan Young. He wrote a history of Central City in '93, and more recently a book that Rita and I edited, 206, the history of opera in Denver. And I'm sure you can find these in libraries, and you might want to pick up a copy if you're kind of serious about opera. This is what I'm going to talk about, and I've put 2 dates, the beginning of the period I'm going to talk about and the ending. The beginning date is fixed with the fact that it was the first year that something showed up in Colorado that could respectively be called an opera company and performed a comic opera. Today something like that we probably call a musical, but it was called an opera back in those days. And the 1925 date is rather arbitrary. It could have been 1920 or 15 or something like that. But I picked that date as a cutoff for old Colorado opera because around this time, a lot of major events were happening. And one was that we were shifting from an agricultural country to a more industrialized country, and so there was a concentration of population into urban areas and out of towns like Craig and the former Steamboat Springs and other small cities across America. Many of them shrank, many of them died. And those were the basis for the touring entertainment companies. They toured all those towns back in this 50-year straddling the 1900s. The vaudeville, the Chautauqua, the lecturers, the dog and pony shows, and so forth. They did the urban areas, but they hit all these towns as well. That was their bread and butter. And so when we became urbanized, the number of opportunities for touring companies was diminished. But there was another more significant factor that made this transition happen, and that was the advent of talking pictures. The last opera house was built in Colorado in 1914, to the best of my knowledge. Starting in about 1915, 16, 17, 18, they started building movie houses. And movies became the rage, and people turned away from live stage entertainment. The movies were a grand, wondrous hit. And so there was not much incentive to keep some of those touring kind of productions going around the country. They became pretty well localized only in the major cities, not in the smaller towns and communities of the United States. So this is the period we're going to talk about and what happened in this interim period between those particular dates. This is when the opera house movement occurred, and I have to make it clear exactly what an opera house is in a very broad definition. They didn't necessarily have operas performed in them. They had all kinds of other things performed in them. They were basically community centers, community halls, and they had local plays performed there. They had high school graduations, they had balls, they had political meetings, they had speakers. Some of them had good floors, they could take up the chairs, and they had roller skating, a very common activity back in those days. So it was anything and everything that happened in these operas. Some of them did have operas, but some of them had traveling opera companies. Some of them had their own little local opera companies. Delta had a quite respectable Gilbert and Sullivan company for many years. So it's quite variable. So you'll get the idea as we go along what we mean by an opera house and how it may or may not relate to opera. Well, the first opera, so-called, was put on the House and Opera Troupe, and it was the very popular composer Offenbach and his Duchess, the Grand Duchess Gerolstein. And this was performed in the Denver Theater. It no longer exists. Went down long, long ago in Denver. And then this company went up to Central City and performed in the Montana Theater, which later burned down. And this is a kind of buffo opera that was very popular at the time. People worldwide love this kind of wacky opera. And this is the kind of music that you would associate with this kind of opera. Okay? People love to laugh and be entertained and be gay, and this was the kind of thing that appealed to them. This is the wedding march from this particular opera. It must have been a lively wedding. The next event of any consequence was 1875, the Ware group that came to Denver and performed in what was then called Guard Hall. And it was named after a governor's guard, which was a quasi-military outfit that built a hall where they could practice their military maneuvers and all their falderall. And they had some area for stage performance, and so that was used by the Ware Opera Company in 1875 when they came through. And then the company went up to Central City, and now the new theater was called the Belvedere. And the performance occurred there because the Montana had burned down that year, and they performed in the Belvedere. And I'll show you a picture of the Belvedere shortly. That theater is still there, a very decrepit state in Central City. And if you would classify it as an opera house, it's actually then the oldest existing opera house in the state of Colorado. The kind of music, again, that they perform would be this kind of stuff. You've probably heard that before. That's the can-can from Orpheus's Orpheus in Hell. So, well, yeah, in the underworld specifically. Thank you, Gil. Gil is my opera expert from Fort Collins, a colleague, he and Margaret over here. So, good, Gil. Keep me on track. Then the Oates Opera Company came in 1876, and they did some comic operas in Denver. She was regarded, by the way, as a provincial favorite. She toured all these small towns in America, and so she was kind of put down as provincial favorite. As far as she was concerned, she thought that was very complimentary. She liked the idea of performing for small town of America. She was preparing for.
What is her name?
Her name is Alice Oates. Alice Oates. Excuse me for not mentioning that. Alice Oates. And she was preparing for an international tour, and suddenly died at the age of 32. Now, the first really so-called serious opera was 1877, and this is Guard Hall that I mentioned before. The Governor's Guard did their maneuvering there. And this was the Richings Bernard Grand English Opera Company. Now, that term English simply means not from England. It means they performed everything in the English language.
Oh.
Okay? That's what it means. And at that time, worldwide, it was quite acceptable, in fact, kind of standard, that you performed an opera in the local language. If you're in Germany, you performed in German. If you're in French, you performed in French. And if you're in America or England, you performed in English. And it's actually only fairly recently that we have demanded that everything be performed in original language. There is one company I know of which still performs in English, and that's Opera Theater St. Louis. Up until a few years ago, Central City also did that. It changed over about 6 years ago. Well, anyway, the Richings Bernard was our first Colorado adventure into real opera. Caroline Richings had married her tenor named Bernard, and he became her business manager, and they toured for many, many years. They were a troupe of 30 artists, including 7 lead singers, a chorus, and orchestra. And they traveled by train. I should have mentioned, by the way, that the house, and when they came in, they traveled by stage, which is kind of slow, and I'm sure they didn't carry much baggage. But now, trains reached Denver in 1870. From 1870 on, then you could have major troops coming in with orchestra instruments, scenery, costumes, and so forth. So they did a small circuit in Colorado. They offered Floto's Martha in Pueblo in July 13th, 1877. And the following night, they were in Colorado Springs, and they did Wallace's Maritana. Then they stopped at Denver in Guard Hall. They presented Maritana on July 16th. They did Verdi's Il Trovatore on the 19th. They did Albert's Fro Diavolo on the 20th. They did Martha in a matinee, and Balf's The Bohemian Girl in the evening on Saturday, July 21. And they wound up on Sunday doing Marriage of Figaro, and actually it was done at a different hall. It was done at Turner Hall, which was owned by the German community. Turner is a term for athlete in German. Turnverein is the name of the organization. And the Germans weren't too particular about Sunday performances, but there was a Christian feeling about Guard Hall that they shouldn't be doing opera and having too much fun on a Sunday night. So they moved over to Turner Hall for that one. This hall became, the following year, Forrester's Opera House. It was leased by Nate Forrester, who renamed it Forrester Opera House. So this was the first opera house then in Denver, and it existed for several years. up until 1881, when the Tabor Grand was built, and it was so outclassed that it couldn't survive as an opera house. This company, after performing in Denver, went up to Georgetown and they performed at Cushman's Opera House. They did a couple performances up there. They did Trovatore and they did The Bohemian Girl. And they did Martha. They did 3 operas up there. Now, Cushman's still exists in a truncated form in Georgetown. The 3rd story was the opera house. And somewhere in the 1880s, they had a major crowd up there that weakened the structure, and so they kind of banned it as a place for large gatherings. But some of the lodges continued to meet there, but then a snowstorm in 1950 smashed in the roof, so they took the 3rd story off. So it stands today as a 2-story structure in Georgetown, and it was, what's called, the name of the restaurant was there, the Silver Queen. It was there for many years. It's still a restaurant, but it's not called Silver Queen. But if you go up there, on that corner, where's the restaurant on the south, on the northwest corner, that was Cushman's Opera House. Now this other opera house existed contemporaneously, and that's McClellan's Opera House. This one was located on the other side of the street and a little farther east, and this building that you see over here is the so-called, as the natives call it, Hotel de Paris. If you've been to Georgetown, you know where that is. Now it's an empty lot where this was. It burned down. Mr. Cushman was trying to thaw out some frozen pipes in the wintertime, crawled under his house with a live bucket of coals, caught some spider webs and other debris on fire, and he watched his opera house burn out. So, the end of the McClellan Opera House. Well, after they finished in Georgetown, of course, they had to go to Central City. Central City was always interested in entertainment. Welsh Miners there loved theater, and they loved singing and so forth. So Richings Bernard went up there, and they performed at the Belvedere on July 27th and 28th, and they did The Bohemian Girl. Now, this is the Belvedere, built in 1875. And it still stands there today. It doesn't look quite as good as when this picture was taken. It's very shabby. There have been a number of discussions about renovating it as a theater. It hasn't happened yet. If they don't do it soon, it's going to fall down. Now, the opera was Bohemian Girl. Balfe was an English composer. This was the most popular opera of its day. Everybody loved the Bohemian Girl. And this is one of the melodies from that opera. Very famous melody. Anybody know what that is?
Don't you?
Don't know that? That's I Dwelt in Marble Halls. Now that was so popular that it was frequently sung, interpolated as we say, in other operas that had nothing to do with. There would be a space where there was a kind of a okay break, and the diva would sing, I dwelt in marble halls, and all the audience would weep. It was that popular. Another one I'll tell you about shortly was The Last Rose of Summer. That was also frequently interpolated into operas that had no connection at all with that opera. The audience expected it, and frequently they demanded it, that the opera company could not quit until they'd sung either Marble Halls or Last Rose of Summer, or both. And as I mentioned, you know, the opera is performed in English regardless of the native language, and there was a great deal more freedom about what you could do on stage and what you could get away with, and it was not a rigidly controlled professional thing at that time. It was pretty liberal in what was accepted as acceptable at that particular time. Now, we come to 1878, and this is what I call boom times. And it was boom times in terms of the mining activities in Colorado were really paying off very well, and people were getting rich. Towns were getting affluent, and everybody had to have an opera house to be respectable. You had to have some kind of a town hall, you had to have some churches, and you had to have an opera house, and of course, a school or two. And so, Central City built this opera house in 1878, Welsh miners, stone, still used today. So it is the oldest existing, still in use opera house in the state of Colorado. Over in Leadville, Horace Tabor built this opera house, the Tabor Opera House. And right next to it in this picture on the right is the Clarendon Hotel. And this is where the fateful meeting between Elizabeth McCourt and Horace Tabor occurred. If you haven't heard of Elizabeth McCourt, that's Baby Doe. The story of Baby Doe. That's where they met. And you notice there's a connecting ramp up the top between the two. That must have been kind of convenient for Horace going over to visit Baby Doe, perhaps. Anyway, Clarendon is not there, but the Tabor in Leadville is still there and has performances in it to this day. It was kind of compromised seriously a few years ago, especially by the Elks when they owned it. It was the Elks Opera House for a while, and they did some rather bizarre renovations, but mostly it's still pretty intact for what all it's been through. It's done pretty well. The next major event was this building of the Tabor Opera House in 1881. The opening of this opera house was truly a phenomenon. Newspapers devoted entire pages to the opening of the Tabor Grand. Special trains ran from Boulder, from Fort Collins, from Colorado Springs, and many other points. The creation of an opera house costing more than $680,000, that was 600 miles west of what was then considered civilization, was regarded as a truly remarkable accomplishment. The date was September 5, 1881. And parenthetically, let me mention that the old Metropolitan Opera House, the one that was 39th and Broadway in New York City, that didn't open until almost 2 years after the Tabor opened in Denver. Did you know that? Well, for such a grand event, and you see the carriage with the horses waiting in front, wouldn't that have been a grand way to go to the opera? The house was open, the inauguration was done by Emma Abbott and her Grand English Opera Company. There's that term, English again. She opened with Wallace's Maritana, and then as an extra added, Mrs. Abbott also did the mad scene from Donizetti's Lucia di Lammermoor. The company continued after the grand opening to present operas at the Tabor House over the next 2 weeks. So they did the whole standard popular repertoire of operas at that time. And this was a song that brought tears to everybody and that was commonly interpolated into those operas. Everybody knows that. Now, Emma formed her company in 1878, and she traveled small towns and major cities of America for many years. She had a rather large company. It was about 60 members that was in her group. And she was called upon to inaugurate at least 35 opera houses in her career between 1878 and 1890. So if you had a new opera house, you wanted to get Emma Abbott. She was the star for the building of that. An interesting peculiarity of Emma was that she was very Christian, and she was called Pure Emma. And her troupe would not perform on Sunday, and she made sure that all of her troupe went to church on Sundays. And one of the interesting things she did, she loved the opera La Traviata. And La Traviata is about a fallen woman. And so she could not possibly do an opera about a fallen woman. She kept the melodies, she changed some of the libretto, and she called the opera Cecilia's Love. she also made appearances in Colorado Springs, and she also played Leadville. Now, to make a success out of bringing operas and their companies into Colorado, Colorado had a disadvantage of geography. The railroad line, the main line, east-west, between New York and San Francisco, went through Wyoming, went through Cheyenne and Laramie. And so here was Colorado dangling down here to the south. As I mentioned, we got the railroad in 1870, but it was not convenient on a tour to hop, 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 and come down into Colorado and hit the towns of Colorado. So what Peter McCourt did was create something called a silver circuit to make it economically more attractive to hit towns in a pattern and navigate through without hardly slowing down. Peter McCourt was an older brother of Baby Doe McCourt. And Tabor, running his opera house, had started out with William Bush, who was his business partner from Leadville days. They parted ways because William Bush was not really happy at all with Tabor for dumping Augusta. And Tabor shunned him then because he would not accept Baby Doe as his legitimate companion in life. And so William Bush left in a huff and later built his own theater opera house. So now Tabor was out of manager, he tried a few, unsuccessful. Baby Doe suggested her brother. Turned out Peter McCourt was a wonderful manager, impresario, loyal person, had great friendship that lasted forever, and it was very, very successful. So he established these things called Silver Circuit, and varied from time to time. You see a sample here of the cities that were in the Silver Circuit, and you see the lines running here from Cheyenne down to Denver, and they would go down to Trinidad, Pueblo, and then up through here and wind up in Provo and Salt Lake City and beyond. And so they basically could do a town a night, and in about 6 or 7 days, they hit Denver and they wind up in Salt Lake City, doing a production every night. And so it made something much more likely and feasible, profitable by making this kind of arrangements. As the railroad developed, first it was just a front range kind of loop, and then as the railroad punched through the mountains, then we started picking up Aspen and Glenwood Springs and Grand Junction and so forth, and they did. All those places were on the circuit at one time or another. From Trinidad to Fort Collins and in between, and then over to Canyon City, Leadville, Aspen, Glenwood Springs, Grand Junction, so forth. All those were serviced by these companies moving on Peter McCourt's Silver Circuit. A couple of interesting opera houses. This guy named Jerome Wheeler was living in Manitou Springs, and he had property in Aspen, and he built first the opera house in Manitou Springs. It's now an antique store in Manitou Springs, but it was a bank opera house combination. Commonly, opera houses had to be more than just an opera house. The opera house was a loser in terms of making income, and so you combined it with some sort of business. And commonly, a bank was associated with it, a bank and then some stores, and one of the floors would be an opera house. In the case of the Wheeler, the third floor was and still is the opera house. The bank was on the first floor, and then some businesses, offices on the second floor, and so forth. Well, Mrs. Wheeler encouraged him to build this house and opera house in Aspen. He had property there. He did. And he also built the Jerome Hotel, and he also built a very nice family home, which they hardly ever occupied, but it still stands today. All three of those structures are there. The Wheeler is still in business today and does operas every summer, and many things in between. It's used very extensively, several days a week. It is the main entertainment center for the city of Aspen to this day. I mentioned that William Bush peeled off in his partnership with Tabor. He built the Broadway Theater in 1890, and it was combined with a hotel. Those towers you see are hotel structures, and his opera house was built into this thing, beautiful opera house. And that house went down sometime in the 50s. Do you recall, Gail? It actually went down before the Tabor did. The Tabor turned shabby and lasted a little longer, but eventually tore both of them down. And Emma Juk at that time was kind of the reigning diva of the circuit, and she was the one who inaugurated that particular opera house. She did a 2-week run, and she opened with Carmen. Carmen was a fairly new opera, and was becoming very popular. And the 2-week run included Tannhäuser, Lohengrin, and the Fliegende Holländer, Flying Dutchman, I'm sure, because it was in English. But anyway, that, as far as I know, was the first time German operas were done in Denver. And later some strictly German opera companies came through and actually performed in German, but those were opening guns on German opera in Denver. As an aside, speaking of how operas were done in a somewhat casual and propository way, the Boston Lyric Opera Company, which was the predecessor of what later became the Bostonians, hit Denver in 1901, and they did a Bizet, Carmen Bizet, that was written in French. Well, the 3 Italians in the cast sang their lyrics in Italian, and the others sang it in English, and nobody in the cast sang French at all. And that was not uncommon, that the cast would sing in different languages, whatever they had learned it in, making a difference. Well, a little local history. Craig, so over that way in case any of you non-natives don't know, about 50 miles, 40. Had an opera house in 1891. It burned 4 or 5 years later. There's a replacement building which was a town hall and some other things, and it's on the east side of Yampa, just north of Victory Way, and it's now a Chinese restaurant called the Galaxy. After that was lost, they created a new house over on Russell, on the east side of Russell, just north of Victory Way, and it was the new Craig Opera House. It's now owned by Mr. Shepard and his plumbing business, painted this delightful blue color. And obviously there was a door in front of this thing which has been covered up, and that little extension you see off to the right is a concrete block addition to the house. It wasn't very big, but it had a stage in the back, and mostly local group performed there. As far as I know, they never had a traveling opera company there, but they had a lot of local entertainment that participated there in their opera house. So they really did have something they called an opera house. This is something about the evidence, if you can read that, about what went on around here. This is from the local paper, the Steamboat Pilot, and the first one in the upper left says the Craig Dramatic Club is preparing to present another drama at the Opera House. The drama is entitled A Noble Outcast, or Jerry the Tramp. It is a highly interesting play and will be the best ever presented in Craig. Now the next item down to your left is a telling item. It says, another matter of importance in Steamboat is an opera house with a lodge room above. This could be built by a stock company, and the various lodges could put the top story on for their benefit. A good opera house would be a great benefit to the town in many ways.
Here, here.
This was 1901. And this is to tell you that, as far as I know, it never happened here. This must be about the last town on earth that did not have an opera house. And that's really curious. Now they obviously had some place for performance, because you read about Hayden and Craig and Steamboat trading plays between their communities. So I don't know where they performed, but sadly Steamboat never had an opera house. But the upper right-hand corner is an item about Yampa, which is down south of here, and a much smaller burg than Steamboat, and it alludes to a Thanksgiving ball in the Opera House, and that's in Yampa. They had an opera house. And the later parts detail improvements in the Opera House, and then the last one at the bottom, the 1907, is bragging about having one of the finest opera houses in the territory. It's credit to the community and the spirit of the town. So anyway, that's the evidence we have of what took place in the Opera House movement around here. Now I want to talk something about the opera companies that played the circus in America and certainly came to Colorado, and one of them was the Bostonians. They performed over many, many years. They were one of the most frequently performing. I've given the dates there that they came to Colorado and performed. And they performed throughout America and Canada, and in many cases they were the only company that would hit some of these towns, especially into the 1900s. And I want to read you this about their intended appearance in the town of Telluride in 1907. And this article is from the local newspaper in Telluride, and it's titled "Victims of Hard Luck." And it gives you an insight of what it was like to be with or be in charge of an opera company at the time in America. The Bostonian Opera Company, which shows in Telluride tonight, although they are taking their troubles philosophically, have been up against it good and plenty. There are 38 people in the troupe, which is an expensive outfit to carry in Colorado. After billing in Leadville, they were kept out by a smallpox quarantine. And the Cripple Creek Opera House, in which they were to show, burned down. And that was the Grand Opera House, which was their very best opera house, and it burned down just shortly before they would show up there. It was less than a month, knocking them out of both days. So they come here from the north tonight, go to Durango tomorrow, and from Durango clear out to Provo, Utah, thence to Salt Lake. If the company makes expenses in the small towns, they can thank their lucky stars. And people who like good comedy can consider themselves fortunate that they can get to see so good an outfit at $1 per. For it is seldom indeed that we have the chance to witness an attraction like the Bostonians are said to be. Now happens another interesting craze, and that was the Gilbert and Sullivan phenomenon. Started in England with the D'Oyly Cart Company, as you probably all know, and it quickly spread to America. Within 2 years or less, whatever occurred in the Savoy and London would be playing in New York City and Boston and San Francisco and so on. And when one of these came out, it was immediately pirated by everybody in the world, and pirated versions were put on everywhere. In one of the later ones, I can't remember exactly which one it was, Gilbert came over to New York to put it on because he knew they were going to steal it, so he was going to do it himself and at least make some money out of what happened in America. But this was really popular stuff, and this kind of music was exactly the kind of stuff that America wanted to hear. It was funny, the lyrics were wacky, and the entertainment was royal with this kind of opera. Now, the curiosity of this is that juvenile opera companies were formed based on the most popular at the time pinafore of the Gilbert and Sullivan series. One of the entrepreneurs in London suggested that wouldn't it be nifty if we had an adult company performing pinafore and we had a children's group performing the same opera in parallel. Cute, okay? And they did that, and it was a wow. It was a great success. And of course, it had to be copied in America. And so there was a guy named Haverley, an entrepreneur, formed Haverley's Juvenile Opera Company, and they toured throughout America with children, 12-year-olds, 15-year-old kids, doing these roles, dressed up in costume, performing these operas. There was even this company, the Pollard you see over on the right, was from New Zealand. And it was formed around the Pollard. They had a whole bunch of children, and they augmented with some other children, and they formed the Pollard Juvenile Opera Company, and they came to America. They performed in Cripple Creek and other towns around here, and we have on the website up in Old Colorado a chapter by my friend Stephen Bush about this juvenile opera company phenomenon, and a man who's writing a history of the Pollards saw the page and was amazed and delighted to discover that his subject of interest had toured in Colorado. He didn't even know that, and so he was very pleased to find that they had ventured out here beyond the limits of civilization at that time. This is a company that was very faithful in coming to Denver to perform Grand Opera. So Chicago showed up with the company for many years and performed high-quality operas for a long time. They performed, by the way, at the Denver Auditorium, which was built in 1908. It was built, the impetus was to get the Democratic National Convention there, which they did, and by curiosity it became de facto opera company. When the Tabor became no longer viable, everything in the major way of entertainment moved into the Denver Auditorium. And as you may know, just a couple of years ago, the interior of a large portion of what was that auditorium was taken out through the roof, and a new opera house, the L.A. Calkins Opera House, was installed. One of the finest opera houses in the world exists inside the old shell of the 1908 Denver Auditorium. But anyway, the Chicago Opera Company came here for many years, and one of the great stars for several years was Mary Gordon, a wonderful diva. She truly was a diva, but she was a great voice and a great character. She ran the company for a while, and she bankrupted it and turned her back into a diva and took her out of management. One of her curiosities was she loved French, and she sang virtually everything, every role in French, regardless of the original language. When the Chicago group came, it was usually under the auspices of a man named John Charles Schaefer, who had been in Chicago and who had been instrumental in creating the Opera House in Chicago. He was a newspaper man, and so it was natural that he would import his known company from Chicago to come to Denver and play in the Denver Auditorium. And he would house the company on his ranch east or west of Denver. He was developing the area that became the Kim Carroll area. Do you know that area? And so Barry Garden and company would be housed by Mr. Schaefer up there during their visit in Denver. This was another long-touring opera company. Fortune Gallo formed this opera company, and they toured hither and thither across America for many, many years. An Italian who came to America and did a wonderful job of touring this company around all over the place. I want to tell you about some of the singers who showed up in the opera companies here. Adelina Patti came in 1884. She sang La Traviata with Mapleson's Her Majesty's Opera Company. And Sir Henry Mapleson was in England, and he formed this company and brought it to America. And Adelina Patti was one of the stars of that particular opera. Lillian Nordica sang Rigoletto in Her Majesty's Opera Company. She was a New England girl, and tragically, she went on a tour in Australia, and she caught a boat going back to civilization, and it hit a reef and floundered for several days, and she was exposed to some bad weather and got ill, and she died in 1914, and she's buried in Java, far from New England. Minnie Hawk, on the right here, I have to tell you something about Minnie Hawk. She was Carmen. She was the first Covent Garden Carmen. And she's an American girl, and she was with Mapleson's company, Her Majesty's Opera Company. She made her Paris debut in Sonnambula in 1869. This girl was considered a wonder. The fact that she was such a wonderful, great singer, and they knew that she was from somewhere in primitive America. And there were great stories that were created about her, hyperbole that you can't imagine. And it started out with the fact that it was discovered that her folks lived in Missouri, close to the western boundary of Missouri. Her father was into boat making on the Missouri River, and little Minnie would go out wandering on the prairie when her folks weren't keeping track of her, and there was some Indian nearby, and they called her Little Prairie Flower, and they took care of her. They rode her on their ponies, they showed her how to shoot a bow and arrow and play games and so forth, and that went on for several weeks, and the parents finally discovered what she was doing. They hustled her off to a boarding school right away. But the stories about her cavorting with wild Indians lived on. So here are some of the kind of things that were promulgated about her. The young singing sensation from the New World was described as kind of a half-civilized Pocahontas, who back in the wilds of her homeland was accustomed to riding a Mustang bareback and being worshipped by the continent's aborigines as a dusky daughter of the sun. A Parisian newspaper reported how a New York millionaire, traveling one day on the vast American plains, was attacked by Indians who subjected him to the most hideous tortures. Suddenly, a beautiful maiden dressed in wampum and buckskin appeared out of nowhere, singing Batti Batti from Mozart's Don Giovanni. Her dulcet voice instantly soothed the savage beasts. The grateful millionaire immediately whisked his mysterious savior off to New York City, where he built her a marble opera house and poured his fortune at her feet. Joanna Gadsky, great singer, very young, at age 23, she was Elsa in Lohengrin with the Damrosch Opera Company. That was a German opera company. Some of you may be old enough to remember Walter Damrosch, radio and so forth. He had a younger brother, Frank, who was in Denver for several years, and he became the first director of music for the school system of Denver. Later went back to New York. They were the sons of Leopold Damrosch, who immigrated with his sons. Nellie Melba, you've probably heard of her, an Australian with quite a wondrous, strange beginning, and quite a star. Marcella Simbrick sang in Don Pasquale at the Broadway in 1901. Geraldine Farrar, if there was a diva, was Geraldine Farrar. She loved being a diva, and people loved her as a diva. Alma Gluck, probably the most popular recitalist of the day. She preferred recitals to doing operas. She turned in kind of mid-career to just doing recitals. She loved the recital circuit. Her second marriage was to Ephraim Zimbalist, Russian violinist. They had a son named Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. If you're old enough, you may remember him from the movies. Okay. Louise Homer. She was a grand contralto with the Metropolitan for many years. Wonderful, wonderful voice. Martinelli, he was basically the successor to Caruso. Caruso, in fact, gave him his costumes from Pagliacci, and he was regarded as the natural inheritor of Caruso's roles. Caruso made only one appearance in Denver in 1920, and he died the following year, by the way. Rosa Poncel was a really interesting case. She made a Met debut at age 21, became a legend, and until she appeared opposite Caruso in that debut in 1918, she had never set foot on a performance stage before. And a totally improbable story, but she became wonderfully successful. She had a 19-year career following that debut. Tito Schipa did a concert at the auditorium in 1922, and I should mention that we're shifting over from opera singers singing operas to touring singers. The opera company stopped touring, but the opera singers now became recitalists, and there's a lot of touring went on into the 20s and 30s and even later. Tito was the highest paid artist, one of the highest paid in the US for a while. He lived a luxurious life, rather a wastrel, and he was a womanizer, but he had apparently a really good time. The great Russian bass, Fyodor Shaliapin, did a concert in 1923 at the auditorium. Lawrence Tibbett, 1924, did a concert at the auditorium. He was a principal at the Met for 27 seasons. He was not only an admired actor, an admired singer, but he was also a Hollywood actor. Some of you may have seen some of his movies. He was what was it called, the Red Something Other and Desert Song and so forth. He did those kind of swashbuckler movies to rather great success. Now, to wind this up, I want to tell you that there is an opera house in Red Cloud, Nebraska, which is a very typical opera house. In Red Cloud, Nebraska is like any town in America. And it had this opera house as its main center of social, cultural activity. And the person who has made that opera house world famous is Willa Cather, because this was her hometown, and she went to this opera house as a child. And I'm going to have Rita read to you the words of Willa Cather about how she remembers her opera house in Red Cloud, Nebraska.
Excuse me. Willa Cather spent her childhood in Red Cloud, Nebraska, which had an opera house, and that opera house is still there today. These excerpts are from a letter Cather wrote in the Diamond Jubilee edition of the Omaha World Herald on October 27, 1929. When I go about among little Nebraska towns, the thing I miss most is the opera house. A traveling stock company settled down at the local hotel and thrilled and entertained us for a week. That was a wonderful week for children. The excitement began when the advance man came to town and posted the bills on the side of a barn, on the lumberyard fence, in the plate glass windows of drugstores and grocery stores. My playmates and I used to stand for an hour after school, studying every word of those posters, the names of the plays and the nights on which each would be given. After we had decided which were the most necessary to us, there was always the question of how far we could prevail upon our parents. Would they let us go every night or only on opening and closing night? How good some of those old traveling companies were, and how honestly they did their work and tried to put on a creditable performance. There was the Andrews Opera Company, for example. They usually had a good voice or two among them, a small orchestra, and a painstaking conductor, who was also the pianist. What good luck for a country child to hear those tuneful old operas sung by people who were doing their best. The Bohemian Girl, the Chimes of Normandy, Martha, the Mikado. Nothing takes hold of a child like living people. This brief selection was from The Song of the Lark, written by Willa Cather, and it was based loosely on the life of Olive Brimstad.
That's the show, folks. Thanks very much.
Did anyone have any questions for Mr. Roth before we
Where
conclude?
did they get most of their training?
The singers,
Yeah.
most of them were trained in Europe. There was a developing set of teachers in America. Some of them had careers in America and came back to America to teach. We had some of those in Denver, for example. The first serious classic singer teacher was probably Gene Brola, who had a career in Europe and then came back to Denver and opened a studio. That was very typical. But at that time, if you aspired to an operatic career, you probably went to Paris or maybe Germany, but most commonly Paris. Any other questions?
Do you have any idea where the Opera House was in Colorado Springs?
Yes, but I haven't quite sorted it all out yet. There's some confusion about it, and I think maybe it's straightened out if I go back to the Pioneer Museum and look at what they have there. I can't remember the streets very well in Colorado Springs. There were probably three. We know for sure there are two. And one was the Burns Opera House, which was built in the late 1880s or early 90s. Beautiful opera house, built by a man named Burns who made his fortune in silver. And it became a movie theater. I think it was called The Chief. And then, do you remember that?
It's on
Okay.
McAllister.
Hmm?
McAllister
With what,
Street, isn't that the name of the street?
the
No.
street?
No, it's going Kyle.
On Tejon, isn't it? Well, okay, one of the opera houses is on Tejon. Where Burns was, I don't know. But the Burns is now a parking lot for a bank or something like that. The other one was on Tejon, and the location it's supposed to be, I checked and it's not there. Where it's supposed to be is a blank. There was an existing picture of that opera house on this website, and under houses under opera in Old Colorado. And I don't know where that was located. Presumably there's another place on the west side of Tejon, a little further north, that was formerly an opera house. I haven't been able to verify that yet. But anyway, there was an opera house in Tejon, and there was an opera house wherever the Burns house was. And one of them presumably still exists as a restaurant or a store or something to this day. Pueblo had a wonderful opera house. It was designed by Louis Sullivan, a famous American architect. He did a number of notable structures in America, including the county jail and county office buildings in Pittsburgh. And that one, amazingly, had an awful fire in 1922 and was destroyed. It was the best opera house at the time in the state of Colorado. So we had a lot of them. There were, I don't know how many, but I know there are at least 150 opera houses have been built in the state of Colorado. And I can give you little figures on what their current fate is. I think I have some numbers in here somewhere on how they are faring. I can't find it. But anyway, there are about, I think, 14 opera houses that are surviving in the state of Colorado. About 8 of them are still called opera houses. A number of them are movie theaters and some sort of entertainment venue. Most of them have been converted to something else or torn down or burned down or something. We have only a small handful left. Anyway, on the website, if you look at Opera in Old Colorado, it gives you all the data on which survive, which don't survive, how many we have, and so forth.
Charles, maybe you'd like to introduce Carrie?
Yeah. I want to say something about Emerald City Opera, because we're going to have an opera here in August. This will be the 5th year, the 5th production for this wonderful opera company. And as I mentioned, there are 13 opera companies currently performing at least one opera here in Colorado, and Carrie Rustoy's Emerald City Opera is one of them. And so this noble and persevering grand lady is
Should
Carrie
I fall
Rustoy.
on my sword now?
Carrie, take a bow, Carrie.
Hi, if I haven't met you, I'd love to talk your ear off about Emerald City Opera. We have some information about our 5th anniversary production of Madama Butterfly here for you, and a poster about it if you want to take it. Has anybody here attended an Emerald City Opera performance? Thank you. Thank you. We are doing Madama Butterfly this summer, and just so you know a little